to Melanie is the director of the Weatherhead Center. It's yours, Melanie.
Great. Thank you so much, Ted, and welcome everyone to the final session for this academic year of the Weatherhead Forum. We really appreciate your joining us virtually this year for our attempts at community building online. We very much look forward to adding back the in-person component next year of the Weatherhead Forum and other events, and being able to build community face-to-face as well. As many of you know, the Weatherhead Forum showcases the research of the various units and affiliates of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. And today's session, I'm very pleased to say, features the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. The topic for today is representation and accountability under weakly institutionalized party systems, perspectives from India and Peru, and possibly from Brazil as well, I'm hearing. And as Ted said, I'm Melanie Kamet. I'm the director of the Weatherhead Center in the department, and I'm also a professor in the Department of Government at Harvard. I'm very pleased to briefly introduce the chair of today's session, who is the chair of the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. First, let me say 2 sentences on the program itself. The Harvard Academy was founded in 1984, and it's dedicated to building knowledge about the culture, history, and institutions of the world's major regions and countries, focusing everywhere around the world except North America, which we leave it to others at Harvard to cover. And to accomplish this goal, it sponsors the Academy Scholars Program, which is a 2-year postdoctoral program, the Academy Fellows, a 1-year postdoctoral program, and organizes seminars and conferences and supports Harvard faculty research and publications. This year, the program has 12 postdoctoral fellows in residence, all of whom are working on book manuscripts and a variety of other publications. And the program also has a group of senior scholars, which is a distinguished group of senior members of Harvard's faculty who act as the Academy's oversight committee and select the new Academy scholars and serve as mentors to them as well. I'm very pleased that my colleague, Timothy Colton, is the chair of the Harvard Academy and is also chairing this session. 2 words on Tim. Tim is the Morris and Anna Feldberg Professor of Government and Russian Studies in the Government Department at Harvard. He's also a prior director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and a past chair of the Government Department at Harvard. He's produced a number of works on Russian and Eurasian government and politics. And a recent co-authored book from 2017 is entitled "Everyone Loses: The Ukraine Crisis and the Ruinous Contest for Post-Soviet Eurasia." I am going to resist the urge to pepper him with questions about what is going on. And instead, I'm going to turn it over to Tim, and I look forward to hearing about the exciting research being conducted at the Harvard Academy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Melanie. Our book and article titles, we were just talking about that, chatting before we got started, don't always resonate so well 5 or 10 years later, but I'm proud to say that I sort of bucked that trend. I think the title of that 2017 book is still pretty descriptive of what's happening today. So I would like to take the occasion just to thank the Weatherhead Center for being such a friendly host to us. The Harvard Academy, it's been around for a long time. For years, it was organizationally somewhat adrift. It didn't really have a home, but it now has one in the Weatherhead Center. We have operational autonomy, but also all kinds of division of labor with the Weatherhead Center, which is entirely in everybody's interest. So Melanie knows all about this because she was my predecessor as chair of the Academy and was herself an Academy scholar some years ago. All right. So as Melanie said, we have scholars with us in several categories, and it's very difficult, given the divergent interests and skill sets, for that matter, of our scholars, to find a common theme. We're not really in the business of coordinating or guiding or anything like that. Really, we want to support what people are doing. But we were able to come up with a rather neat combination for you today. And this is just 2 from our considerably larger group. The group will be rather bigger next year. Actually, we'll have more than 15, I think 15 or 16 scholars in residence. So we were happy to invite two of our scholars to present aspects of their work today. As Melanie said, the general theme is representation and accountability in weakly institutionalized political and party systems. Tanushree Goyal is an Academy Scholar in her second year in the program. Her first year, unfortunately for us, she spent in exile, in COVID exile in the UK. She is a recent PhD from Nuffield College, Oxford. She's about to begin an appointment as Assistant Professor of Politics, I think is the exact title, at Princeton, and we're very proud of her in that regard. She's going to talk about, I'll just read out the title, Gender and Machine Politics, How Women Increased Representation and Responsiveness and Patronage Democracies. You may see a slightly different title once it's on the screen. And Julie Ann Weaver is one of our Academy Fellows. She works also on political representation, parties, elections. I'm tempted to say accountability, but you're going to see her explain how that isn't necessarily the case. And her presentation, her paper is titled Voting Them All Out When Re-Election Fails to Create Accountability. Tanushree will draw mostly on data from India, and I think to some extent Brazil, and Julie from her comparative studies of Latin American polities. All right, that's all you're going to hear from me. Tanushree, the floor is yours. We've got about 20 minutes per presenter.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Melanie, for that introduction, and also to Sarah and Ted for organizing this seminar, and Kathleen. I'm very pleased to present my book project. Let me just share my screen. So, okay, you can full screen. Yes, so here we are. The title hasn't changed as of yet, but hopefully from the comments, from this seminar, it will be better and punchier. So this is what I'm presenting today is my book project. And I'm just going to start with the motivation for this book project. And for motivation for this book project, as well as most of my research, is this very striking graph, which you see here. If pictures could tell, a story, I think this one tells you multiple stories. So what you see here is women's number in world parliaments, across several years, so from the 1980s until today. So what we're seeing is an increasing, a rapid rise in women's representation in world parliaments. So we see that women have entered, women's numbers have doubled in the last 2 decades. And that has been, the story across the world, and also in India, where I study this question. So women numbers have increased in parliaments in India too. While at the same time, what we see in this graph is that we are still far from parity. So women are only a quarter of all the world's legislature, and the numbers are even fewer in India. So while women are increasingly entering parliaments, we are still far from seeing parity. And the reason why, that is problematic is not only for normative reasons. So when we see pictures like this, where we see very few women leaders in the world today, it's also normatively problematic. But also we know from research that when women are represented in parliaments, it increases welfare gains for women. And it also sets up a cycle which increases and promotes women's political participation. So from this previous graph, we know that women are far from parity. And what this research is telling us is that by not including women in, or by not having equal representation in parliament, we are far from realizing the full potential that women bring to politics. And some of the key questions that remain open in the area of women's representation is, why do women, when they get into parliaments, have these positive effects on substantive representation and political participation? And can women's entry in one level of politics have knock-on effects on women's representation across political levels in the future? So can bringing women into politics at one level introduce these knock-on effects that can resolve some of these problems that we saw in the previous graph? And two of the things that we've learned from research is that women indeed increase substantive representation and political participation through 2 mechanisms. So one is illustration effects. So women act as role models, and they change women's attitudes and perceptions. And seeing women win elections also lowers the taste and statistical biases of party leaders. So through these illustration effects, women in politics present a channel to resolve women's political participation. And at the same time, women hold preferences that are more in line with women's interests. So by being in parliament, women are more likely to legislate and implement policy that promotes women's interests. And in doing so, women increase welfare gains for women. However, these mechanisms assume that women have to necessarily change attitudes or entrenched beliefs to accomplish these outcomes. And most of my research questions this assumption. And there are several reasons why we think we need to think about this assumption more carefully, is because we know that attitudes are slow moving and hard to change. So we need to think of other channels, through which we see these effects. And these also have policy consequences, as we'll see in the forthcoming slides. So my argument is basically that let's look at institutional effects. So what is happening inside party institutions, or when women enter in politics, at least at one level of politics. And what I argue is that when women enter local politics, they change party institutions. And they do so by recruiting women as party activists. And in doing so, they increase both political parties' access and responsiveness to women voters by mobilizing them to participate in politics, so lowering the gender gap in political participation, while at the same time incentivizing party leaders to promote women talent, which lowers the gender gap in parliaments. And to give you more insights from my fieldwork, what you see on this slide are some images from my fieldwork in Delhi, in India. And on the first panel, you see is a woman politician who's organizing a little neighborhood meeting at the local, kiosk in Delhi. And what you see is a lot of women have collected and are listening to her and are engaged in what she's talking about in politics. And when you see what's the process through which these women have arrived at this kiosk and are attending this meeting, what you see is this mobilization being conducted by party activists. So party activists are informal grassroots political party members who work on behalf of politicians and parties and mobilize citizens on the ground. So here you see is a woman party activist who's reaching out to women citizens at large in the neighborhood and asking them their opinion, providing them information about a particular policy. So it's a liquor policy in Delhi, which has been introduced. And what you see is this woman signing a petition. So this grassroots politics through which women are recruiting women party activists and mobilizing women citizens is at the center stage of my argument. And throughout the presentation, I will explain to you why are women engaging in doing so. So what are the incentives women politicians have to really recruit these women activists? And what consequences does it have, downstream consequences it has for democracy and development in countries where this form of politics is prevalent, which I call machine politics. So in the remainder of the slides, I'll take you through the theory, and I'm going to share with you very briefly evidence from two cases from India and Brazil, where I provide evidence that women actually do engage in recruiting women as activists. And I'm going to show you some of the implications of women's grassroots activism for democracy and development. So I won't be able to go through all of them, but I will cover some of them and the conclusions. So the theory is about why are women engaging in recruitment at all? So why are they recruiting grassroots activists in the first place? And why do they tend to be women? And to understand this question, I take a feminist institutionalist lens to understand the incentives men and women have to both win elections and become successful politicians, and also focus at the same time on the types of inequalities and norms that they have to abide by to become successful. And my argument is that both men and women, as a result of gender inequalities and norms that are inherent in any institution, so in this case, political parties, create different incentive constraints and norms of acceptable behavior that men and women politicians have to abide by. So if women want to be successful, there's a different toolkit that is available to them, different set of incentives that they have to succeed in politics. And just to give you an example, for instance, we may see women are more collaborative inside parties, not because they want to, but they're expected to do so. So these expectations that exist inside institutions promote certain behaviors from both men and women. So my argument is that women are more likely to invest in party recruitment and in building the party's grassroots bases of support. And I argue that this is because of three reasons. So the first is that women are more reliant on the party, so rising up the party ranks to access high-level politics than men. So for instance, men can directly parachute themselves to high-level politics. However, women have to put in the grunt work to rise up and access high-level politics from which they're otherwise shut down. So they are much more dependent on the party and therefore invest more in the party because their fates are much more strongly tied to the party. So that's one reason why they're more likely to invest in party building. The other is that women are more party loyal and they are less able to switch parties. And both things we see in the data. So for instance, in the Delhi case, we see that while there are fewer women in high-level politics, most of them do have backgrounds in local level politics, while that is not the case for men. Similarly, we see that women both in India and in Brazil are less likely to switch parties, which means they're more party loyal and are more likely to invest in the party. And women are also, because they are generally outsiders and have had fewer opportunities to build celebrity or other forms of capital in, say, finance or other pipeline careers, they're more likely to depend on the party brand, be it weak or strong, to recruit members and followers than are men. So relative to men, women have more incentives to invest in party buildings. So while women are more invested in recruiting and building party membership, which I call party building, they have fewer resources to do so. So we know from research that while men, by existing in parties, they're able to attract more patronage, they're able to get wealthier while they're in office, women are less able to do so. So we have countless empirical research showing us that. And because I argue that because women have fewer resources, they're more likely to optimize by recruiting women as activists. And also different types of activists than men. So one dimension is gender, and I argue that they are more likely to recruit women activists for these reasons because it is cheaper and gives comparative advantage to women to recruit women. So for instance, in the case of Delhi, I find that women politicians are the only sort of a policy solution we have if we want to lower both family constraints on women's participation and at the same time lower party gatekeeping constraints on women's participation. So women are able to negotiate both with family gatekeepers and party gatekeepers and bring women inside the party organization. So while men do not have the same advantage. The reason women do so is because they benefit from recruiting women as activists. So when women recruit women, it enables them to claim credit for recruiting party members more visibly. So when party leaders see, lots of women activists present in the party, they're more likely to credit women politicians for bringing them in. And at the same time, because women give this visibility to women activists, they're also more credible sponsors of women activist talent. At the same time, recruiting women is role congruent. So society expects and parties expect women to recruit women. So it sort of checks all boxes. So it gives them advantage, enables them to claim credit, and also lower social sanctions that they face in conducting politics. So it's a win-win strategy. And as a result of that, I argue that women are more likely than men to build parties, and to build parties by recruiting women as activists. And this has implications. So when women enter grassroots politics and are mobilizing on the ground as activists in countries like India and Brazil, this has downstream implications for both democracy and development. For instance, what I see is in my research that when women activists are present and campaigning in political parties, they're more likely to access a women voter, and they lower the gender gap in partisan mobilization, partisan mobilization in ground campaigns. As a result, parties are able to access women voters who they otherwise are unable to access due to this inefficiency they have in their organization. And we know that when women are contacted, or when anyone is contacted to participate in politics, they are more likely to participate. And this is what I also see in my research, that when this gender inequality in who is contacted is lowered, women are more likely to turn out to vote, and women are more likely to participate in other forms of political participation. Women's entry in grassroots activism also helps women to make claims on the state. So for instance, women's grassroots activists are more likely to go and reach out to vulnerable women, so divorced women or women who are domestic abuse survivors, and help them access state benefits, which they would otherwise miss. So these are some of the substantive changes as I see on the ground. Happy to talk more about them, but today I'm only going to focus on political participation outcomes. I also find that by bringing women into the party organization, women have higher chances to get promoted, and more women are present in parliament as a result of this mechanism. So in the next slides, I'm going to show you evidence just convincing you that women actually do engage in recruiting women as activists. And to bring back the focus on women's grassroots activism, this graph shows you that one of the reasons why grassroots party activism is an interesting outcome of participation to study in itself is because we see there are vast gender gaps on who becomes a party member in the first place. So across the world, women are less likely to become party members, and especially in the context of India, this has one of the highest gender gaps in party activism in the world, close to Nigeria and Pakistan. So again, we see these vast gender gaps for which we do not have an explanation so far. And the reason why we have missed so far studying women's grassroots activism is because it's very challenging to study. There is selection bias, so we don't know. Women might select into constituencies where it's easy for them to recruit women. Also, data on party activists does not exist in the way we have data on women as legislators or data on other forms of formal politics. So grassroots activism is a very untangible, very hard to measure at scale. So most of my research is focused on trying to solve these two issues and provide you convincing evidence on the substantive theory that I have. Happy to get into the issues with data collection, but I can assure you they're really severe. So, an example of showing you how hard it is to collect this data is from Delhi. So what you see here are two these are not campaign posters. These are just internal party signaling poster to show to party leaders, look, I have these alliances in politics. And what you have is a woman party activist, her, sort of pamphlet and a man's pamphlet. And here you see that there's this woman party activists. So while you can still get data on who these party activists are, there's this whole hierarchy of informal activists who work under her, who are never observed through data. And this sort of signaling is what enables women to claim credit, like I earlier talked about. While at the same time, you see men activists and their alliances very visibly on these political posters throughout the city and in different contexts in India as well. So to resolve this challenge on how do we access these how do we know these informal members? How do we measure their activity? I have two approaches. So to solve selection bias, I use a natural experiment of gender quotas in India, and I use a closed elections RD in Brazil. And happy to talk more about these methods as we go further. To resolve the data issue, I collected original data in India using a citizen survey in which I include a new measure, which asks citizens whether they were contacted by a party activist, and also asks them about who contacted them. So it asks about the gender of the party activist who contacted them during the ground campaign. The only other country, perhaps in the world, which offers data on party membership is Brazil. So I actually took data on party members in Brazil, which is the only exception where I can study this question. So I'm going to show you evidence from both countries at scale. So here, looking at do women recruit party activists in India, here I use the experiment in Delhi. What I just want you to understand from this is a natural experiment, and it assigns, as if randomly, it assigns women politicians in some constituencies in Delhi than others. So by simply comparing means of party activist activity in reserved versus non-reserved constituencies, I can say who is more active in a given place. And what I find is that in places where women are contesting elections, more women activists are active. And this measure, which is the gender of the party activist, is what I use to provide evidence. Just to give you a small example, the activity of these party activists is so intense that if you want to compare just the Delhi's local campaign in municipal elections in 2017, it's the same as if we had to conduct Obama's entire national campaign only in New York City. So that's the level of intensity at which these party activists are involved. And what you see is increasingly that women have taken role in these campaigns. So what I find is, using this question, did anyone visit you? And if they were a man or a woman, what I find is there are very few citizens who report being contacted by a woman activist in constituencies where there are no women politicians. So non-reserved constituencies, you see men and women about 5% respondents report meeting a woman activist. However, in reserve constituencies, we see a 2.5 times increase. So about 15% citizens, both men and women, report meeting a woman activist. So this measure confirms to us that women are active on the ground and are actually changing the way things are done, as reported by citizens, which is an independent measure away from politicians and political parties. However, a concern is that perhaps, women are just more effective in some places than others. And to allay this concern, I use several pieces of evidence, such as I shadowed ground campaigns, I conducted representative surveys of incumbents and party workers, and I find the same evidence that women are the ones who are credited for recruiting women activists by both women activists and politicians. And I think the most discerning evidence is from ground campaigns. So by shadowing ground campaigns in Delhi, what you see are these stark images of how men conduct their campaigns versus how women conduct their campaigns. And they are extremely gendered. So while men would go around with their men activists, you will see women with hordes of women activists occupying prominent positions in their political campaigns. We also randomly selected campaigns in a completely different election, which is a non-quota election, and we see the same story. So you see here a woman politician coming along with her women activists and actively making an effort to reach out to women and contact them in their homes. So they often say women activists can go inside the kitchen, men are shut out at the door. And this is what changes in ground campaigns. While you look at men's campaigns and what you see is the status quo, they mostly have men activists. And when you look at the crowd, it's mostly men activists and mobilized men to attend. So you see these very different pictures of citizen participation emerging as a result of this grassroots activism, both in qualitative and quantitative data. So going back to my other case, I explored the same question in Brazil. And in Brazil, I have the advantage that I'm able to use longitudinal data on party membership. And what I see is, because Brazil is this setting where this data is available on party members, I'm able to see that across all parties in Brazil, there's a gender gap in party membership. So what you see here is, while we would expect perhaps PT to have the lowest gender gap, that's not the case. We see it across parties. Women are about 10% less likely to be party members across parties in Brazil. And we see that most constituencies in Brazil are biased towards men. So in most constituencies, men are party members versus women party members. And what you see, however, is looking at mayoral elections in Brazil, that when a woman wins a mayoral election, you see that she's no more or less likely to engage in recruitment. So despite having fewer resources than men in Brazil, women are equally likely to build parties. So this goes back to the original point that despite lacking patronage resources, women are still engaging in recruitment, which speaks to their stronger incentives for recruitment. While what you also see is, however, they are the only ones who lower the gender gap in recruitment. So when you have a woman mayor, she is more likely to lower this gender gap that we saw earlier very substantively, so about 60%. And what you see is we can attribute this difference to gender because we do not see men reduce this gender gap in party membership at all. So it's solely coming from women mayors, and we attribute this to gender. So to summarize, what I've shown you so far is that indeed, as I would expect from my theory, women are more likely to recruit grassroots party activists and lower the gender gap in party activism. So now going back to the implications for democracy and development, the one major one being, do women actually change the way parties access voters? And what I'm going to show you is that in constituencies, so going back to Delhi, which are reserved, what you see is parties are less likely to contact women than men. So this blue figure shows you that about close to 65% men report being contacted by a party activist, but only 50% women report doing. So there's close to 20% percentage point gender gap in contact by parties. However, in constituencies where women are present, this gender gap halves. So it still remains. So it's not a problem which is entirely solved, but it's halved, which is highly substantive. So parties are twice as likely to contact women in these constituencies relative to the ones where there are no women. What you see is that this that contact is increases political participation. And what I'm showing you here are point estimates for being contacted. So conditional on being contacted, both men and women benefit from contact. So they're more likely to know who their counselor was, or more likely to know who the politician is and who the winning party is. They are more likely to have voted in municipal elections, and they have they're more likely to participate in civic protests and other forms of political participation. So by equalizing contact, women increase, women's political participation. So the conclusion is that I conclude that women in local politics are more likely to recruit women as grassroots party activism. And this lowers the gender gap in party activism, which is substantive to study on its own right. And the reasons why women engage in party recruitment at all, and especially recruiting women, is because of these gendered inequalities and incentives that institutions create, which increase the incentives women have to engage in machine politics in this form. And women's entry in grassroots party activism has implications for both women's political participation at the citizen level as party activists, and also their ability to access promotions and survive in parliaments. It also enables women to deliver substantive representation to women citizens. So women are able to mobilize bureaucrats or protests in front of bureaucrats' offices if they're not delivering on things that women want. So what you see is increasingly women politicians relying on these activists to mediate state access for women citizens. So this is the process through which they're delivering substantive representation on the ground. Also, one interesting bit is that because by being with other women, women are able to also challenge politicians against remarks on sexual harassment or other disparate remarks that women constantly face, when they conduct politics. So by being present with other women, they're able to lower violence concerns. And so this mechanism basically has multiple implications for how women are effective in parliaments and the reasons why they enter and stay in parliaments. And the reason I argue—
we're pretty well out of time here. I'm sorry, it's Tim.
Okay, so I'm just ending now. And so I think I'll just end at that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. That's great. Very informative. All right, let's turn now to Julie, who's going to talk about a somewhat related subject, but different in several ways, as you'll soon see. So Julie, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim and Melanie. It's great to be able to present at Weatherhead and with the Academy. So I'm going to be presenting on the book project that I have been making good use of my postdoctoral fellowship time to work on. And so the title is Voting Them All Out: When Re-Election Fails to Create Accountability. All right, so I want to start just by setting out the premise, or really the promise, of electoral accountability. So the intuition is really simple. It's this idea that the carrot and stick of re-elections creates this really should be simple tool for voters, right? So politicians do a good job in office. They should be rewarded. If they do a bad job, they're voted out. And that this incentivizes politicians to want to do a good job, right? But we actually see across the world poor governance, high corruption, persisting, suggesting electoral accountability is failing, in particular in that poor performers continue to be reelected. And we mostly know why this happens. So two really large explanations. One is performance information constraints. So voters just lack access to information about how they've performed, or voters may prioritize other aspects of candidacy, right? So partisanship or ethnic identity, et cetera, outweighs incumbent performance. But what I want to suggest with this book is that actually what we can see is a new type of electoral accountability failure. So a new sort of phenomenon, like suggesting that electoral accountability fails and for which we don't really have a good explanation. So I start by reminding us all that to be incentivized to perform, politicians really need to perceive both that they have some kind of reasonable chance of winning re-election, so a non-zero chance, and importantly, that good performance helps that chance, right? So they're more likely to be elected if they do a good job in office. So is this really the case? So what I'm showing here are differences in re-election success rates and mayoral elections across a set of Latin American countries. So these are country averages across elections in the 2000s and 2010s. This is the percent among incumbents that seek re-election, what percent of those win. And so what you can see is that there's not only really wide variation, but actually some countries have really low rates, right? Peru, Ecuador. These are countries in where, roughly only about 30-ish% of incumbents who seek re-election actually win. Guatemala, Panama, and the 40%. So why is this happening? We don't actually have a good explanation for why. We also have really strong evidence of an incumbency disadvantage. So in developed democracies, principally in Europe and the United States, there's a lot of evidence that incumbents enjoy what in political science we call an incumbency advantage. So the idea that there's something about incumbency that just makes it easier for them to be reelected relative to challengers. But an emerging literature is looking at this in the developing world, and we actually see in a lot of cases that incumbents have a disadvantage. So there's something about incumbency and about holding office that's turning voters off, and that this really makes electoral accountability impossible. So next, in 2018 in Peru, there was a referendum about congressional reelection. Amazingly, 85% of Peruvians voted to make it impossible for congressional reelections to run for reelection. In March in 2005, Peru's Congress had already banned mayoral reelection, so mayors could only serve one term in office starting in the next election. And interestingly, about 2/3 of Peruvians agreed with the law. So most people wanted to make it impossible for mayors to run again. So this is really sort of puzzling, right? If we think that offering politicians the chance to run again is what incentivizes them to perform, then why would people whole scale want to just make it impossible for mayors to run? And finally, a little bit later, I'm going to show you evidence that in the case of Peru in particular, this anti-incumbent bias is so strong that even good performers are punished. So good performance is not helping these mayors to overcome this bias and to get reelected. Right. So overall, I'm suggesting that these phenomena together show us that there's this different reason why electoral accountability is failing. Right. It's not just that people are re-electing bad performance. It's actually the opposite. It's that they just reject the idea of re-election overall, and that performance doesn't help incumbents secure a second term. So this is really important, right, that we understand why for sort of concrete political outcomes. So one is that politicians have little incentive to perform. In the global South countries that I study, particularly at the local level, this is really where efforts to reduce poverty, to provide infrastructure and public goods, this is where this is located. And so bad performance has really important implications there. You could also imagine where this would sort of create a downward spiral where increasingly bad candidates run, and then citizens are develop these increasingly worse attitudes about incumbents. And finally, evidence suggests that extreme anti-politician bias could undermine support for democracy overall and weaken political participation. So we really want to understand why is this happening? So what I've already done so far is discuss the puzzle and motivation, this failure in electoral accountability that we can't yet explain. I'm going to offer my own theoretical explanation and the evidence testing the theory in Peru. I'm going to talk a little bit about generalizability of the theory, focusing on Latin American cases before wrapping up. All right, so why is this happening? Why is electoral accountability failing in this particular way? So again, existing explanations are insufficient. The biggest one is this information constraint. People just either don't know how politicians are performing, they don't understand the information, it's too complex, or they just have a hard time attributing blame. They don't know if it's the politician or the bureaucrat. They don't know if it's the regional government or the local government, et cetera. In addition, aspects of identity outweigh incumbent performance, but both of these accounts presume that voters are willing to reward or punish, at least to some extent, right? That they're willing to entertain the idea of granting a second term, that they think that re-election is a good thing. So they can't explain why voters punish strong performers, and they can't explain why voters would prefer to ban re-election despite these supposedly incentivizing good effects. So my explanation centers on weak horizontal accountability. So what I mean by horizontal accountability are government institutions that are designed to police other government institutions. So different agencies overseeing each other. So in particular, I'm looking at appointed agencies. These are supposed to be autonomous agencies that oversee other government officials. So some examples would be the ombudsman, supreme auditing institutions, different pieces of the judiciary, special prosecutors for corruption, et cetera. So we have a lot of evidence that weak oversight yields worse performance. This is in terms of both corruption and what we call shirking, or just not expending effort, not doing what it is that you're supposed to be doing. So we have a lot of evidence that this is the case. And so what I argue is the first step in my argument is that this weak oversight that yields poor performance, which then causes voters to really start questioning the intrinsic motivation of all politicians. So doubting that politicians are in it for the right reason, that they're in it to improve their communities, that they really want to sort of create development and opportunities for people in their communities, right? So people come to doubt this kind of intrinsic motivation. But importantly, for re-elected incumbents in particular, weak oversight institutions make it so that voters question the constraints on their behavior in a second term if they are re-elected. And the reason why hinges on political learning. So the idea that politicians are actually spending their first term in office learning how to better circumvent government controls, and then if they're re-elected, they're going to act on this impulse. So focusing a bit on this idea that learning on the job leads to greater corruption and shirking if re-elected. So that we often assume that politicians' quality increases across terms because of learning. But it can actually work in reverse. And so there's some evidence beginning to emerge of this happening. Romania, India, Italy, these are contexts of weak oversight. And what researchers have been able to show pretty convincingly is that incumbents who are re-elected are more corrupt than they were in their first term, and that this effect is actually increasing over time. So incumbents who are re-elected 2 times are more corrupt than those who are re-elected first, suggesting that there really is this mechanism of learning on the job. That this learning can take place in 2 different ways: avoiding detection. So I learn on the job about what the systems are in place to prevent shirking or corruption, and so that makes me better able to get away with it. And second, that I'm developing these networks of collusion. So I'm interacting with people, I identify people who are willing to be corrupt, and we develop stronger relationships, and that makes it easier for us to collude. So again, the idea is that all politicians learn on the job, but weak oversight makes it so that voters are more likely to believe that incumbents are going to act on this new knowledge, right? I may learn how to be more corrupt or shirk on the job, but if I'm worried about sanctions, if I'm worried about being punished, then I'm not going to act on it in a second term. So that's the intuition. So finally, the sort of last big piece of this argument is the idea that weak oversight makes it so that good current performance in office no longer predicts good future performance. So a big sort of theme in electoral accountability is that we assume that good first-term performance is a useful predictor of second-term performance. So we assume that good performance is going to be repeated. So I argue actually that this is something that, because it's so implicit in electoral accountability, as researchers, we've never really sort of sat down and thought to ask people, is this really what you believe? So it turns out that not everyone thinks this way, right? So what I'm offering is a qualification on the retrospective voting model. In particular, I argue that people make 2 separate evaluations in re-elections, right? So they not only ask, how did the incumbent perform, but they also want to evaluate, well, what's the likelihood, if that incumbent did a good job, what's the likelihood that that good performance is going to be repeated if re-elected? And so what I argue is that because of this aspect of political learning, combined with questioning the intrinsic motivation of politicians, when oversight is weak, voters come to doubt that this good performance will be continued. And so this explains why people want to punish good performers, because good performance isn't helping them to see, oh, re-electing this person is a good idea, and to overall decide that actually maybe we should just ban election outright. So one thing I want to really emphasize is that my theory about weak oversight is really unique to weak party systems. And I'm going to walk you through why I think that's the case. So the reason is that political parties help keep this minimum threshold of voter support for incumbents. So in other words, they prevent this kind of whole-scale rejection of incumbents from taking place. And there's 2 main ways that they do this. So they can do this directly by offering patronage benefits or clientelism. So if you're getting benefits from the party, then you're more likely to re-elect the party's incumbent, even if you sort of start disdaining politicians, or even if you think that learning on the job is happening. Perhaps less, maybe more normatively acceptable is the idea of partisan loyalty. So if you're a strongly partisan voter, then you're going to re-elect the incumbent. And so again, it's keeping this floor, this minimum threshold on support. And parties can also do this indirectly because they're incentivizing better performance. So if people see better performance, and then this kind of outcome hasn't been developed. Okay. So the next thing I want to do, so I outlined my argument. The next thing I want to do is present a little bit of the evidence from the case of Peru. This is a short talk, so I'm not able to really go into detail about everything that I cover in the book, but I wanted to give sort of a taste of the bigger pieces of the evidence. So in the book, I focus on 3 main outcomes of electoral accountability failure, and I'm going to talk you through a little bit about the evidence for the fact that weak horizontal accountability explains those 3 outcomes. So the first one is the incumbency disadvantage that I talked about earlier. So I've used a regression discontinuity design. The intuition here is that you compare candidates that barely lose with candidates that barely win. And so those candidates, they're really similar, right? You wouldn't want to look at a candidate who won by a large margin because that candidate is just inherently better. So you want to look at candidates that are really similar. And so what I find is that actually these barely won candidates who then become the incumbents. In the next election, they're more likely to lose, which is their reelection, compared to challengers. And so the suggests that there's something about the fact of holding office that's making these candidates undesirable, that's making these incumbents undesirable. And so then what I do is I use other data to try and understand what are the characteristics of incumbents that might help them overcome this disadvantage. And so the first thing I do is test performance, right? So is good performance helping these incumbents overcome their disadvantage? And I actually find that there's no effect. So good performance is not helping incumbents overcome this bias. But what does help them is when voters think that oversight is strong. So I take advantage of survey data, asking individuals about their trust in these different appointed agencies of horizontal accountability. And what I find is that in municipalities where voters report higher trust in oversight, those are the places in which incumbents face less of a bias. So that suggests that sort of what does allow incumbents to overcome this bias is stronger horizontal accountability. All right, so the incumbency disadvantage is one outcome. The next is this kind of counterintuitive finding that people even prefer challengers even when the incumbent does a good job in office. So I'm going to walk you through the evidence for this. So what I did is I implemented a candidate choice conjoint experiment within an original survey that I fielded in Peru. And so the intuition is that you show respondents 2 different candidates and you ask them, which of these 2 candidates would you vote for to be mayor of your municipality? So in my setup, I made sure that there was always 1 incumbent and 1 challenger. So that's what people were choosing between, but then I randomly varied different candidate characteristics. And so the intuition is that you can then assess which candidate characteristics are most important and how do they influence people's choice between the 2 candidates. So I'm going to focus here on incumbency since that's sort of the big thing that I'm interested in. So what I did is for the challenger, they were always just presented as this is one of the challengers running for mayor. And then for the incumbent candidate characteristics, each candidate could have 5 different characteristics. So the candidate could just simply be stated as this is the current mayor running for re-election, so there's no performance information, or they could be presented as having done a particularly good or bad job in terms of public work projects like roads and irrigation canals, or having done a good or bad job in terms of providing individual financial assistance. So my previous research in Peru had suggested that mayors, that it was actually quite common for individuals to approach the mayor and ask for help. You know, my roof caved in, my grandmother is sick, I don't have school fees, et cetera, and that mayors provided these kinds of small amounts of money. And so I wanted to include that as a test. Okay, so what do the results suggest? So what the conjoint experience allows us to understand is how people choose between different candidates. And so what I'm going to show here is how people choose between challengers and incumbents. So in particular, how does the performance of the incumbent matter when people are choosing between the incumbent and the challenger? So the first thing we can think about is when the incumbent is presented with no performance information. So this is just simply, this is the incumbent, this is the challenger, who are you going to choose? And what this shows, the dotted line represents 0. And so what this shows is that being the incumbent causes people to be less likely to pick that candidate, so they favor the challenger. All right, so electoral accountability would tell us that, okay, if we tell people that the incumbent did a really good job, this should shift their vote so that they want to vote for the incumbent. So we should find that the estimate would be over here on the right-hand side of 0. What is it that we find? So actually we find that even if the person is told, hey, this incumbent did a really good job in public works, oh, this incumbent did a really good job offering financial assistance, people still prefer the challenger. The same holds true for bad performance. People are updating slightly in the sense that they sort of dislike incumbents even more if they do a bad job. But the point is that good performance is not helping them to overcome this bias. So then what I do, so if you remembered, there were two underlying voter attitudes that were really important to the theory. So the first is the likelihood of good performance being repeated over time. And so what I do is I take advantage of the later survey question so that I can assess to what extent is holding this attitude linked with people's choice between incumbents and challengers. Okay, so this is the full results. I don't have time to walk through them now, but what I want you to focus on is right here, these green dots. This is the incumbency conditions. And so the panel on the right are the respondents that say that they do believe that good performance in one term will be repeated. And on the left are the people who said that good performance will not be repeated. And so what you see is that this inclination to punish good performers, it's concentrated among the people who say that they don't think good performance will be repeated. So I did the same thing about the idea of political learning. So I had a later question and I split the sample then between people who said that they thought politicians learn in their first term and that makes them more corrupt. So those are the people right here on the right-hand side. You see that again, the effect of punishing good performers is concentrated among people who believe that learning on the job is leading to worse performance in a second term. Okay, so the third outcome that I explore in terms of my explanation and others is about this idea that voters want to just eliminate the option of re-election. And so what I did is I did qualitative interviews in 3 different regions in Peru across 6 different municipalities. I also examined newspaper accounts during the time that the ban on mayoral election was being debated, and I also looked at the actual debates in Congress. So I don't have time to go through all of these results in detail, but what I can say is that weak oversight really across all 3 data sources, weak oversight really came out as the big reason why people wanted to ban re-election. And I also found a lot of evidence for these 2 voter attitudes, both learning on the job and doubt about second-term performance if re-elected. So just to give some sort of illustrative quotes to give you an idea, this is from the congressional debates. We should not allow re-election in the current climate. We know that the corresponding institutions are not complying with their oversight functions. So essentially saying, look, the big reason we shouldn't do this is because of weak oversight. Another thing that came out was that weak oversight meant that incumbents in their first term, they were going to use state resources to try and get reelected. It's very difficult in Peru to have adequate oversight over officials who seek reelection and who unfortunately use the apparatus of the state to do so. Finally, from a newspaper account, an example of this view that people learn in office how to be more corrupt. When public officials spend a long time in office, they tend to develop perverse forms of public management in order to get away with crimes like corruption, etc. Okay, so in the couple minutes that I have left, I just want to present, this is a new piece of the book, some suggestive evidence, not only that this same kind of failure that we see in Peru is happening in other countries, but that weak parties and horizontal accountability is the main explanation for this outcome. Okay, so the first thing I want to show is this, as I said, the scope condition about weak parties. So this is just a really simple correlation. Each dot on the plot shows a country election year. The x-axis is the rates that I showed earlier of incumbents at the mayoral level who seek re-election, what % of them actually win. And then on the y-axis is a measure of party weakness. And so what you see is that, as party weakness, the lower levels of party weakness are associated with lower levels of re-election, higher levels of party strength are associated with higher levels of re-election. And then I do the same thing with the measure of horizontal accountability. I'm using the VDEM horizontal accountability index. You see the same thing, higher horizontal accountability being associated with higher rates of incumbent re-election. So voters being more willing to re-elect incumbents. And then just to get a sense of the extent to which party weakness and horizontal accountability interact, you can see here in this third row, the interaction term is significant and positive. So there's a joint impact of party strength and horizontal accountability strength in determining the extent to which incumbents who seek re-election are able to win. Okay, so quickly wrapping up, what I have suggested in this book and in this talk is that we have a new type of failure of electoral accountability, and I've offered an explanation for why that centers on when parties are weak, then weak horizontal accountability is the main explanation. So quickly, some of the implications, we need to understand why electoral accountability is failing in an effort then to reduce impunity, improve local public services, and prevent this kind of citizen dissatisfaction, violent protests, and rejection of democratic institutions that we're actually seeing increasing worldwide. I think the book also suggests that we need to rethink the standard models of electoral accountability. In particular, this idea of retrospective voting, that actually what voters are doing is not only evaluating performance, but they're evaluating the likelihood that that good performance will be repeated. We need to rethink the role of performance information. In particular, my work suggests that information is insufficient without having strong enough institutions of oversight. And then finally, the role of non-electoral oversight institutions in electoral accountability, and that there could be this interaction effect between the two accountability types. So thank you so much, and I look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Julie. Now, Sarah, have you tracked some questions? I have all kinds of questions, but then I'm going to have opportunities to ask them directly. Shall I lead off with something?
Yeah, Tim, you can lead off with your questions. There's no questions in the Q&A. If anyone watching would like to type some in, we'll be happy to take them.
Well, okay, so very quickly, just one question for each speaker. And thanks to both of you for great presentations. For Julie, my question is, I guess, about what you didn't study, which is government officials themselves, elected officials, elective officials. So if they know that it doesn't matter very much how well they perform in office, then what does motivate them, and why do some of them perform beneficially and others not? So you're studying citizens, and that's plenty for one book, obviously, but I am curious about that. For Tanushree, I guess my question would be about the extent to which this process that you trace in India in particular, involving one underrepresented group, namely women, is just the latest experience with a historically familiar pattern where underrepresented groups gain a foothold and then start using various strategies and tactics, partly out of self-interest instrumentally, but also to achieve better representation for their group. One thing that does strike me about women, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's not obvious what the resistance group would be. So women are underrepresented, and then they get somewhat better represented. But your story doesn't include any mention of who might be opposed to this. I mean, is it just a matter of sort of asserting your rights or being activists and sort of going for it? Or is there a struggle against someone else who doesn't want you to be represented? So one can imagine maybe certain ethnic and linguistic communities elsewhere in India or elsewhere, where representation on the part of the insurgent group is actively resisted by someone else who doesn't want them in parliament. And in your case, it's not clear what the resistance group would be. So I just throw these out as a way of stimulating conversation. Let's start with Julie, since I asked her first.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, the book is about citizens. The project is about the citizens side of things. But it is an outstanding question, right? That, like, what is sort of the dynamic effect of this? So I think two things. So, first, what the results and sort of what my theory would predict, is that positive performance information is yielding some small amount of updating, right? So you saw this in the conjoint that, there was a difference between the sort of bias against incumbents between the incumbents that were shown as performing poorly versus those that were shown as performing as well. It's just that didn't get them over the hurdle of being reelected, right? But politicians don't necessarily, right? If you perceive that there is some potential increase or some potential improvement in how voters see you, I think that still can incentivize some sort of minimum level, particularly because in contexts where there is such party weakness, which is this context I'm studying, the barriers to entry is so low, right? So for an incumbent to launch a re-election campaign, it's not very expensive. And, you know, as we saw, incumbents are able to potentially even use the resources of the state to run. And so sort of, there's nothing really stopping them from trying. There's a cynical view, which is that particularly again in contexts like Peru and at the local level where so much of the sort of locus of public action is about public works projects, right? These projects offer a double benefit in the sense that you can be skimming off the top pretty easily, but you also have something to show for, right? So you are doing a good job in terms of these public works projects, and even if you don't get reelected, you know, you've still kind of skimmed off the top while you're in office. So I think that those two kinds of mechanisms you know, are explaining why, despite this overall anti-incumbent bias, that we do still see some examples of good performance in Peru.
Okay, thank you. Tanushree.
Sure, I'll just keep it brief because I think Melanie also has a question. I just wanted to say there's a clear group of people who don't want women in politics, and that's majority of citizens across developing countries. So if you look at, for instance, world value surveys, where you know, there are questions about do women have, should women be in politics, or, you know, do women make better leaders than men? Should they be taking those positions? Majority citizens, both men and women, will say, no, women should not be in politics. So there's clear resistance to women's, you know, entry into political positions. I don't know if that is what you were trying to say, Tim. Also within parties, men are losing opportunities, right, to these women activists taking center stage, for instance, or mobilizing the women vote. So there are clear resistance. There's a clear resistance group. So I think the main one is men who are, you know, mobilizing against both violently, right? So violence against women in politics, for instance, is going up. And when, you know, there was a survey with women politicians, and they blame male co-partisans from the same party as the main perpetrators of violence, not so much as voters, but basically their own peers in the party. So there is clear threat and a politics of, you know, not giving these positions to women that is going on, both from, you know, voters don't want them, peers don't want them. However, these women, these opportunities have existed for exogenous reasons, right? Increasingly around the world, you know, there is quota adoption. So parties have started to extend these positions to women, one reason or the other. And women who have been entrepreneurial are coming into these positions for these kind of incentive reasons, right? People want to be politicians, perhaps to benefit themselves, their families. Political opportunities are valuable in developing countries for precisely the reasons Julie was highlighting, that why people distrust politicians as a result of it. So these women are coming into power for their own ambition or reasons. However, you know, there are clear resistance to their, you know, entry into power. Yeah, I think I'm going to keep it to that. And
Yes, thank you. Just a quick comment. So it's very persuasive, but if it's, like you say, a large majority of the respondents in world values or other surveys, then that must include a lot of women as well, right?
yes.
So how does that fit into your picture?
It does. And I think what is happening is, you know, increasingly what you see is that women are trying to mobilize women, right? So they have an incentive to sort of win women voters. So they are trying to change these perceptions. So there are structural reasons to which we can accomplish these changes, right? Large structural changes. And through acts of everyday, like sort of micro level changes. So these women who are becoming activists are increasingly trying to mobilize those attitudes, but it's extremely hard. So they're persisting despite of that. And I think on the margin, we might see, you know, over a long period of time, some changes, but absence other structural changes, I don't think, you know, these kind of attitudes are going to change. So this is happening within this sort of system. And it's an uneasy equilibrium, I think, but that's where we are at.
All right, thank you. There is a question from Melanie.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for these fascinating presentations. And I see we have some excellent books on the horizon coming out of the Harvard Academy. So I think, you know, and it was nice to see these together, tapping into similar meta themes, kind of depressing in a way, but also some reason for hope. So, so to Julie, I just wanted to ask a question maybe you can't answer, but sort of how do you break this equilibrium? It seems like a negative reinforcing cycle, and I'm wondering what you might think big picture in terms of breaking this. And then for Tanushree, I want to hear more about how the concept of machine politics or patronage democracies matters here, whether that's germane, a scope condition for your project, or whether you think it applies more generally, because we didn't hear much about that, but presumably that's part of the relevant context. And actually, I had a second question that might tie it together, which is, you gave these compelling reasons why women are more likely to invest in party building than men and so forth. And it seems like a lot of it boils down to networks, like women don't have the same kind of networks that men do to direct positions of power. And is that what makes the patronage democracy, machine politics, a relevant scope condition? Is it that they don't have the networks to the patronage channels and whatnot, so they have to work in these institutional channels to build up their influence? And then actually one last thing, as a specialist on the Middle East, I can always point to India as a place that has equally, if not even worse, gender attitudes. I'm sorry to say, people always think the Middle East has the worst, most regressive attitudes towards women, but apparently India gets that prize. And so is this kind of like a hard context, like a hard test for these arguments as a result of that?
I guess I'll start since you asked my question first.
Indeed,
So
yes.
the question was sort of how do you break this equilibrium? I mean, so I have an answer, but the answer itself kind of creates a million other questions, which is just stronger oversight, right? But the real question is, how do you achieve that? And so one thing that I've been thinking a lot in terms of kind of next projects is there's a lot of research that suggests these kinds of ad hoc or sort of one-off initiatives to strengthen oversight really work. So for example, using experimental design, and you tell public officials, look, we are going to audit you, that works. But the real question is sort of how do you bring that up to scale? And I think that's also sort of why accountable oversight is so weak in so many of these countries. Is just simple sort of the logistics of overseeing this many local government officials and the money that it requires to run these audits, right? So I think there's sort of a real question about, how do you bring this up to scale? And then another sort of piece of this that I'm working on in subsequent work is sort of how do people's perceptions evolve? And so you can think about, for example, research on crime, that actually there's a big lag between the time that crime improves and when people think that it is improved, or they think that it's safe, to go out late at night, for example. And so I think there's also a lot of work to be done about understanding sort of how long of a gap between when we actually do improve objectively these oversight institutions and when people start believing that they really are better. So I think both of those are big avenues for future research.
Okay, Tanushree?
Thanks, Melanie, for these questions. And all are such excellent questions. I have to think a little bit more about them, so my answer may not satisfy you. But I think, in the argument, there's a broader part where women are recruiting these members. So these could be party members, these could be party activists, and there's a theory about that. And I think that is more general. However, by introducing these women into party members, because the type of activities these activists do in context of machine politics differs quite a bit from an industrialized country. So for instance, unlike using professionalized campaigns, these activists will be the one who would be mobilizing citizens on behalf of politicians. They would be engaging in problem solving. So the role of party activists is so different in settings with clientelism and machine politics. And that's why I sort of keep it as a scope condition, because of the downstream implications that I trace. However, women, I think if I take Sweden was another case that I was tempted to go to, but I didn't for some reasons. But I would find women recruiting members increasingly in those countries as well. So those reasons, the theoretical reasons would apply there. So I think that's the reason why a lot of people think you could this is a more generic argument, but then I hold back because of the implications of activism that are not so generic. I have to think a bit more about that. And I think you're right to highlight that there's something about women not being able to access high-level politics in patronage democracies directly relative to industrialized democracies. So for instance, there could be mechanisms like primaries or more transparent selection mechanisms that can still facilitate women to come into high-level politics, which may not be the case here. So they are even more dependent on the party machinery or rising up the party rank. So that's clearly something I think I have to think more about. However, we see this throughout, right? We also see that women are still more relying on the groundwork of from local to high-level politics, across the world. So I think I have to think more about that. India is a hard context. I think it is a hard context for the type of activities we see women engaging in. And, because women are not even allowed to get out of the house, right? So women have to these women politicians actually knock on the doors, they convince gatekeepers, they convince mother-in-laws and father-in-laws to let these women, become activists. So women are putting in all this extra work. In a setting like Brazil, where constraints are not as high, you still see women do so. And what I hear in Brazil is that, men mayors would conduct their meetings in the night or in like some strange locations where women can't go. So gendered inequalities could look different, but they affect both like settings. So I think India is a harder case in the sense of what's expected here and what's at stake. So it's kind of nice to see these effects in India for those reasons, but we also see them in context elsewhere.
Okay, I don't see any other questions. So one of the great things about the Weatherhead Forum is that there's a kind of religious belief in finishing by deadline, and we have a 1 o'clock deadline, which is a bit soft, and a very hard deadline of 1:15, and we're just about at the ladder. There is time for one more question if I see one, which I don't. And so let me see, would either Tanushree or Julie like to have a final word in a minute or so? Don't feel obliged, but if you'd like to do that, please go ahead, starting with Tanushree.
I just had a question for Julie if nobody else has a question.
Good. So
I think your argument really makes a lot of sense. And I think it's the most persuasive argument I have seen to explain, this phenomena that we see in India as well. And people will routinely tell you how they throw the rascals out and make very, very similar arguments. But I was wondering, like, I think Tim and Melanie also raised this, it's about the big picture, right? So you say that voters are not, so this is weak accountability. But then in your presentation, you highlighted how politicians who get into office tend to corrupt, loot. So are voters really, not enabling accountability in some way by punishing them? In your conjoint, you actually condition on that information, right? So performance doesn't matter at all in the conjoint. However, in the real world, those kind of signals may be less meaningful and the corruption signals might be more strong. So I don't know if by throwing everybody out in the current situation, are they enabling or, sort of disrupting accountability? And also I would love to see the politicians' perspective, like what Tim said, I want to see what politicians are responding, and I'm sure it's a different book, but.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, well, it sounds like your question is sort of, is this actually just an alternate form of accountability? And sort of, is there, I don't know. It's interesting to think about it that way, right? I mean, I think my sense from the field research is that this is an entirely rational strategy, right? This is not, despite political scientists sort of being unable to wrap their heads around why somebody wouldn't want re-election to be a legal possibility because we think it's incentivizing, right? I think that people really do see this as like, look, like, because second term performance is going to be worse, we have to just eliminate this possibility. So, I think in a way, if you do think that politicians aren't going to perform well in a second term, then it is accountability to make it impossible for them to do that, right? And that kind of then comes back to sort of the big picture question about what makes politicians incentivized to perform. And so, I mentioned kind of in the way to solve this being about strengthening oversight, but I think we also could think about what are the different ways that we can strengthen oversight that's not about, the auditing institutions, et cetera. And so one way is parties, these party organizations do have a role to play in keeping their politicians sort of on task, right? And also thinking about all of the research around what people call social accountability, so ways that citizens are engaging throughout the politician's time in office. I think also a lot about it, now that people have made it impossible to be reelected, what I'd love to look at is sort of how has this changed engagement during that one and only term, right? So maybe people are sort of expecting more and constraining politicians more, and if so, that tells us a lot about sort of what is the best option for accountability. Maybe reelection actually isn't it.
Yeah, I mean, there are, of course, countries that limit high office to one term. Some obvious examples in your part of the world. I also think about the term limits movement, I guess would be the word for it, in the United States a generation ago. That seemed to be very ideological, though. I can remember going on fundraising expeditions to New York when I was a center director, interacting with financial folks. And, you talk about this thing or that thing, and then they would say, so what's your position on term limits? I think for them, it was an article of faith that it's better if politicians are around for as short a time as possible because they're all scoundrels and they just want to all expand government and tax us more heavily and interfere with the profit motive and so forth. So let's circulate them as rapidly as possible. I don't know, is there a sort of ideological component to any of this? I guess that would be my very final question for you, Julie.
I don't think there's an ideological component in the sense of kind of what is the mix of policies that politicians implement when they stay in office for longer. But I do completely agree that this is behind the same sorts of initiatives that that you see in the United States. I mean, for example, police officers shouldn't be assigned to the same neighborhood for 30 years because they're kind of becoming embedded, right? I mean, it's a little bit of sort of the power corrupts.
Native, yeah.
Right. I mean, and I think, so I think in terms of wanting to create term limits, part of it is this kind of learning on the job gets perverted and sort of power corrupts. And then part of it, at least in the United States, maybe this sort of the mix of policies they implement are different. I mean, I hadn't really sort of been exposed to thinking that much, not studying the United States outside of my own, newspaper reading, but so that's something interesting to think about for sure.
All right. It is exactly 1:16, so it's time to adjourn. Thank you very much to Julie and Tanushree and to all who participated today. And I think this is the last Weatherhead Forum for the semester, if I understand correctly. So we'll see as many of you as possible in the flesh, hopefully in September. Melanie, do you want to say a very last word?
I just want to thank everyone. Wonderful ending to the year. Great presentations, lots of food for thought, and we look forward to seeing you in the fall live, many of you.
Exactly. All right. Terrific. Thanks, everybody.